My name is Michael Hnatyshyn, and I just wrote my first novel. I wrote it over the course of the last 3 years, my novel called The Road to Rus. I'm a native New Yorker. I spent 10 years living in Lviv, Ukraine. I've always been interested in Ukrainian history and in medieval history as well, so obviously I was drawn toward the period of Rus. And, I mean, we learned a lot of stuff in Ukrainian history about Rus, and there was very little in the American history books about Rus. So I wanted to make it more interesting. I mean, now we have this popularity of Vikings on the History Channel here in the U.S. I don't know if they show it in Canada or not. And Game of Thrones is popular. So I figured I'd try to, tag on to the coattails of the popularity of that type of thing. And this would be a good time to release the book. The fact that it is the 9th century and that even though there is quite a bit of material to take from, historically speaking, characters are few and far between. We know more or less main characters and events, but how exactly everything was interconnected, we have to connect those dots ourselves. My main goal was to try to stick to the history as closely as possible. I think I did that fairly well. And if you read about the history, a lot of it's sort of disjointed and disconnected. And even in many history books, you don't get that connection of what was going on in Eastern Europe at the time, as well as the Mediterranean and Western Europe and Rome. So I tried to connect all that together and make it work plausibly. If you're reading just a history, it tends to be a little bland. And when you're doing the research on your own, you get excited about little bits and pieces, but, you have to try to figure out a way to put them together so that somebody who's reading it will want to keep reading it, as opposed to say, oh man, this is boring. I don't want to keep reading this, as many people do when they approach a topic about history. So I tried to make it as exciting as possible. I tried to make some dynamic characters that were fictional who played in with the actual historical characters. I mean, for example, we know that there were a lot of Ukrainian plemena, as we say, the tribes, the Polyans, the Siberians, the Derevlyans, etc. But obviously there was no written record at the time, and we have no idea who were the leaders of this tribes, who were members, etc. We just have a general view of who they were and what they did. So, most of my fictional characters are taken as leaders of those tribes, and then how they mesh together to form Kyivan Rus. I would like to think that I didn't take very much liberty. As I said, I tried to stick to the period and the facts as much as possible. I mean, I did an incredible amount of research. I read at least 300 books about the period, and probably even more academic papers written by archaeologists and historians to try to make sure that I got everything as close as possible. I mean, obviously there are a lot of things that historians themselves, amongst themselves, disagree about the period. I mean, one of the main characters that is covered in the book is what people usually think is two characters, which is Ascod and Dir, but I converted them into one person, and I give a plausible explanation of why I did so. There are also other, for example, Omelan Pritsak, who is a very famous Ukrainian historian. He believed Ascod and Dir were two other characters that I have in my book. And after doing my research, I tend to disagree with him. I mean, who's correct and who's not, it's hard to say, simply because with the information available, you have to make your own assumptions and your own conclusions. So I think I offer a fairly plausible one and an enjoyable one to read. When I was thinking about how to connect everything together and what to actually focus the book on, I knew that there was the stories in Ukrainian history that Oleg, nailed his shield to the gates of Constantinople, which Tsargorod, for all intents and purposes in the book. I mean, that's not covered in this book, but I found out that earlier in 860, that the actual Rus had invaded and attacked Constantinople. And that was what gave me the idea to make that the central focus of the book. And that is where I found out that, this was actually a major event. And it was written about in Byzantium as well. So it was actually something that did happen, as opposed to later events, which were like I mentioned earlier, the whole shield bit with Oleg. There is no record of that in Byzantium. So whether that's true or not is also debatable. But there is no question that the Rus, with the help of the Vikings, the Varyags, actually attacked Constantinople in 860. And I consider that to be the beginnings of Kyivan Rus, and I lay that all out in the book, and how that happened, how I believe it happened, how it looks like it happened by doing all the research. So that's the premise of it. Well, the main protagonists are, there would be Vratimir, who is the Polyan Knyaz, and Yaropolk, who is the Siberian Knyaz. They were the first two tribes that actually merged together to form what the beginnings of Kyivan Rus were. And they basically looked for aid from the Vikings in the north. There already was a Rus Khaganate in northern Eastern Europe, which was led by Viking traders. I have them make a deal with them, and they send their representative to the Rus, and he eventually becomes their leader, and they start uniting. And the Polyan Knyaz has this idea that we should do something big in order to try to get the other tribes to unite with us and attack on the probably most impregnable city in the known world at the time, was what he came up with, and that is basically the story of the book. I also try to make it where I'm not just doing it from the point of view of the Rus. I keep changing the point of view in the book. I also write part of the book as the point of view of Photius and Bardas, who are central characters in Constantinople at the time, and the Emperor Michael as well. And I also try to bring forth the point of view of the Saracen Arabic world as well, and how all three of these interconnected and how they meshed to get this story to its conclusion. So there are a lot of different historical characters, a lot of different fictional characters, but I think they blend well together. Obviously, there are people on the territory of Ukraine, of Russia, of Belarus that all have forebears in Kyivan Rus. But if you look at the history, technically, Muscovy was formed as someone who wanted to break away from Rus. So saying it's like saying that Americans and the British have a common history, but the Americans wanted to break away from the British. And when you study American history, for example, you don't study British history as part of the history of America. And that's the way I look at Kyivan Rus, as it has its roots. Ukrainian history has its roots there, but Russia wanted to break away from it. So technically, even though part of them came out of there, they wanted to break away from it. So claiming that as their ancestral history is a little bit nonsensical, as it would be in American history books to say that, we're all English and British. My favorite answer to something like Rus belongs to Russia is, why then are you afraid of the trident? It is probably the most prominent symbol of Kyivan Rus, yet the Russians tend to say that's a Banderite, symbol. It's evil. Then, how can you claim to be, descendants of Rus if you find the trident an evil symbol? It's about as simple an answer as you can give them. I still had the interest before I left for Ukraine, and it's always something that I wanted to do. But to say that living in Ukraine specifically gave me more of a push to do this, I don't know. I mean, while I was in Ukraine, I was involved more with the student exchange programs and things of that nature. I did do a lot of reading while I was there, and I found a lot of material in the Ukrainian language, even though obviously there was much more in the Russian language. I probably would have done this whether I had lived there or not, because this is something that really interested me my entire life, and I wanted to get it done, and I finally forced myself to sit down and do it. It's, there are just so many, and there are a lot more that are coming out that even I'm waiting for with bated breath. There's actually an author that I really like now called Christian Raffensperger, I believe is his surname. He wrote a book on Rus's connections with the rest of Europe, and he's currently supposed to have a book coming out on all of the royal marriages between the Rus princes and the actual royal houses in Europe and Scandinavia during the Rus period. So I'm actually waiting for that book to come out before I start work on my second book, because I'm sure there's going to be a wealth of information there that I haven't found. I mean, there's tons of stuff. There's, Tolochko, who is a famous historian in Ukraine who's written a wealth of material on the period. There's also, as I mentioned earlier, Omelian Pritsak, who wrote The Origin of Rus, which is, though, more of a scholarly work, so you have to actually sit there. It's sort of like when you're looking at The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion. So Pritsak's work would probably be like the Silmarillion, where you have that entire historical thing just laid out and debated and discussed, whereas as Lord of the Rings would be the more interesting read for the layman. Oh yeah, I mean, I read all of their stuff. I took excerpts of their ideas and melded them with other ideas and tried to form my own. Obviously, Hrushevsky. There's the big debate between the Normanist view and the Slavic view, whether the Vardiags, the Vikings, had a big impact or not. And when I finally came down to it, I don't see how they could not have, being the prominent travelers of the time. So that's the way I went, and that's the way I believe it happened. There's actually a lot of debate. It is mostly in the academic world, though. That's the problem. You have plenty of scholars who write about the subject, but there's very little mainstream knowledge of it, which was part of the point of writing this book, was to get all of that research that they did as well, and to try to incorporate it into my book and to sort of get it out there in a more mainstream way. As I said earlier, there's that big debate between the Normanists and the Slavicists. So I mean, a lot of people have debated this throughout history, and every year there are more and more archaeological discoveries, and we learn more. So a lot of those pieces tend to change as more knowledge is gained. But, like I said, my whole point is to get more people interested in it and talking about it, because it is a fascinating period, and it is probably the real formation of the beginnings of the history of Ukraine. Probably my biggest influence would be a writer who writes about this period as well that got me interested in it is Bernard Cornwell. He also writes about this same period, but from the perspective of Britain and the UK and how the Vikings influenced the formation of Britain. So I would say my topic is analogous to his. My writing is definitely not analogous to his, because he is a much more polished writer than I am, and someone that I aspire to becoming as good as one day. I read Follett's Pillars of the Earth, and I would tend to think that my description of parts of Constantinople were inspired by his architectural descriptions as well when they were building the cathedral in Pillars of the Earth. So the part of that is in the back of my head when I'm writing as well. The primary impact that I would like is for, first of all, Ukrainians who don't speak Ukrainian to have access to the history in a sense, in a way that's more fun than sitting down and reading a history book. And maybe for non-Ukrainians, well, people with a non-Ukrainian background, to get interested and to learn more of the history the way it actually happened. Because, like I said, in most history books, you don't see much about Rus other than a footnote in history. And they were probably one of the biggest empires at the time. And they don't get the airtime that they deserve. That's the entire point, to make it fun, to make history fun, to make learning fun. And like I said, people like watching Vikings. They like watching Game of Thrones. I think it's got some of those elements in there. And I hope that it makes it more interesting for people to learn about Ukrainian history. Obviously, it's a big part of our ancient history. I mean, when we read our Hrushevskys, etc., we go back to the Ante and the Skitte. And, that's going back a real long way, and it's more of a anthropological, formation of the future Ukraine. But I think Rus is more accessible and a lot closer to modern Ukraine than someone like the Ante and Skitte, and people can actually picture them as opposed to the Ante and Skitte. So I think it's a good starting point for trying to form your idea of what being a Ukrainian is. You had your different plemena who got together and said, hey, let's not be separate anymore, which is kind of analogous to what's going on with Western and Eastern Ukraine now as well. So maybe that's part of the reasoning for me thinking that it's important to get this out, so that you see that all these people got together, came over their problems, united, and formed something great. So maybe that's what we should be doing now as well. I'm not a big fan of rewriting, so what I try to do is I try to make an outline first and stick to it. Obviously, if you're doing more research while you're in the process of writing, some things change, and you go back and you do a bit of rewriting. But I try to do that as little as possible. I try to have my whole story laid out first. And since it is a historical novel, that makes it a little easier, simply because you have that timeline of events that you stick to, and things happen on a particular date. But, every once in a while, when you pick up a new book that came out, or a book that you found that you were looking for months, and read that, it gives you another idea, and then you incorporate it into it. So that was my whole plan, was to try to get as much of that historical feel and accuracy as I possibly could, but to make it fun. Well, there are plenty in the Ukrainian language, but in English, I would think it's probably the first. And it's definitely the first that's about the 9th century and the invasion of Constantinople, the attack on Constantinople in 860. I'm doing a book signing in Philadelphia on the 12th on Franklin Street at the old Uke Center. So if anybody from that area, from the Philadelphia wants to come by on 7:30, February 12th. I'm doing a signing. I'm also working on one for the New York area, hopefully for the second half of February or the beginning of March. On the one sense, it's very, very difficult because you have to do virtually all the work yourself, all the marketing yourself. But on the other hand, you actually have complete control over your product and what it's going to finally look like. When you go with a traditional publisher, they tend to tell you, you've got to take this out, you've got to change this. And when the marketing's done, they could say the history of Russia as opposed to the history of Rus. When you're a self-publisher, you get to do that on your own terms and make your own marketing. So, you're losing out in the sense that, you're losing that big push behind you and all that money that does the marketing, but on the other hand, you get to stay true to what you wanted to write. That's the difference. And as I said, it took 3 years for it to be finished. When it was finally finished, then the problem as a self-published author is that you want it to get done really quickly at the end. When you know it's really close, then you tend to start rushing things, and that could be a little iffy as well because you're finishing with the editing and you're having somebody do the editing, and you're like, get that over with, and you try to want to push it out. But I tried to do the timing as well because now you also have the Russian movie that's coming out called Viking, and they're doing a lot of marketing on that, and they're trying to hit the American market with it as well, and the English-speaking market, not just American. So I tried to get my book out before that became a big thing, simply because they're trying to put a lot of effort into now making Rus their history, even though they've done that before, but now they're making a more concerted effort of doing so. I plan on continuing the series. I mean, if there is interest, I will keep going. If nobody's interested, then I'll have to decide whether it's worth it or not. But so far, I mean, there's been good interest. I mean, I have to keep pushing, keep marketing, since I'm the only person that's doing that. So I hope that there is more interest, and I plan on covering the entire Kyivan Rus period. And if that takes off, then maybe I'll go even further. We'll see.